So, funny little video came up on my feed, and I was thinking, oh, it's the Fire Emblem was never always anime argument or whatever, and I was like, well, I think there's like a little bit of truth and a little bit of lies to that statement. So I wanted to go over this and talk about what's actually going on here, because I think people are not entirely accurate about the statement. However, I will go ahead and say that Fire Emblem has always been indeed an anime game. Like, I mean, come on, it's been pretty obvious. The only difference now is that it's leaning a little more into the anime tropes or whatever from like modern times or current times or whatever. Anyway, there's this video, I suppose. Because there's like a little bit of truth in some of this video, but some of it's a little bit of, well, we'll go over it.
I'm sure you've all heard by now the often used remark on Engage's art direction being too anime, as the aesthetic is compared to the astoundingly popular worldwide phenomenon that is Genshin Impact.
Genshin's not that popular. Come on now. Just because everyone on the internet shoves it in your face doesn't mean it's popular.
I generally don't like watching the new anime stuff, and I just don't like watching anime, I guess. I'm especially not that familiar with the evolution of modern recognizable anime tropes.
Well, at least you're honest about it. But that means that you'll need somebody that has been following anime tropes for quite a few years. We'll say years. Many years for me. Like, I've been at that stuff since the 90s, so I kind of have a good cursory glance of what is and what isn't like trending at that time. So don't mind me, I'm just gonna help you out here as we go along.
Fire Emblem has always maintained some form of realism while adhering to some kind of fantasy anime standard.
Interestingly enough, this isn't entirely wrong, at least as far as art style goes. Back when Awakening came out, a lot of people attributed the to anime argument to things like the tropes and some of the characters' mannerisms, you know, when it was like new. That said, nobody really ripped on the art style too much. Like, it still maintained that Fire Emblem look, quote unquote. After being somewhat grounded in realism for like a very long time, you will find that art style changes are usually always going to maintain like a certain air about them, which Engage does not do. But that's more of the art style change. But it wasn't always about the art style. Like, if it was, then Awakening and Fates would have gotten that criticism as well.
I also appreciate how Genealogy of the Holy War doesn't go out of its way just to try and appeal to fans. Kaga. I want to shape this game according to my desires instead of trying to appeal to the fan base. That said, I also like to watch some popular anime series such as Gundam and Legend of the Galactic Heroes, which feature complicated human relationships.
And this is probably one main point about the to anime argument. When people say to anime, I think they are misconstruing the fact that modern Fire Emblem tends to do things like appease fans and go with the flow with trends. The Kaga era, admittedly, may have had some ideas taken from anime, but he was mostly doing his own thing. He wasn't trying to go for the, oh, this is popular in current anime at the time, as he says this, but he's doing like his own thing. He's not trying to like pander to anyone, and that is one of the key differences between back then and current Fire Emblem. But this is really only true for the Awakening era and onward. One of the things that you'll notice throughout the rest of the games, at least up until the Radiant series, is that while there are light touches of like anime influence, they never go so hard into like aping an art style that's like just the current trend, as well as, say, appeasing fans by using common popular tropes in their characters. Sometimes they'll take light touches, but they're never so blatant, at least not until Awakening. And that's where the argument starts. It's exactly as Kaga says. He's trying not to appease the fan base. He's doing his own thing, and honestly, props to him, because at least in that middle era after he left, the devs tried to like kind of do the same thing where they weren't trying to go like directly for the fan base, and it worked. The GBA games and Atelius games are probably some of the most popular games post Kaga era, like period, at least in terms of long standing. You could argue whether or not Awakening or Fates or even Three Houses are like more popular now, but that might just because they're newer, or they have a bigger fan base because they're newer, and they, you know, their newer games are always gonna have like bigger fan bases than the previous ones, unless they're like crazy diehard like Ocarina of Time fans. But
the early Fire Emblem characters weren't made to appeal to popular anime tropes like the dedes that you often see in anime these days. In fact, hilariously, Kaga didn't even know what a tsundere was until he revealed as much in his developer blog dated in 2008, a character concept memo of a Berwick Saga character.
Interestingly enough, I don't think the whole he doesn't know what a tsundere is as much help, because he did that interview about what, Berwick Saga at this point, especially by 2008. Kaga's already out of the picture. Like 2008, that's when Atelius games are out, and like even then, I think a good example is to look at what kind of influence Atelius had. What kind of influence that Atelius would have taken from around that time era. But yeah, at that point, whatever trends Kaga wants to follow in his own games post FE5, that's like on him. So like whatever Kaga is saying at this point isn't really useful for the current argument. And yeah.
If I had to guess, the huge 180 in art design from the realistic Hirota style of FE5 to the more colorful and cartoonish style of Kaneda's work on FE6 were to appeal to a newer generation of fans on a brand new portable consoles. Say what you want about Kurihana's work on Fire Emblem 3 Houses and 3 Hopes, but I love so many character designs from this game, which, funnily enough, also drew inspiration in its characters from Legend of the Galactic Heroes. Don't get me wrong, I don't religiously follow this balance and have it decide what my favorite and least favorite art styles in the series are, but personally, it does play a role.
So even as you say yourself, like even up until 3 Houses, Fire Emblem always kept out that, at least as far as the art style goes, that balance between like the bright colors and I guess quote unquote cartoonism or whatever, and balancing it with realism and taking light strokes from anime, at least as far as art style goes, because that's what it always, that's kind of like what it always did. Personally, I'm not sure if cartoonish is like the most accurate term, but we'll go with it for now.
Fire Emblem has always been anime narrative because it implies that Fire Emblem, from its genesis, always wrote and presented itself with popular anime trends to appeal to fans at the same level as when this argument really started to take off, which in my experience was in Fire Emblem Awakening. I personally think defaulting to this inherently dismissive and incorrect statement to defend any game's art direction isn't a good idea. Whether we're talking Awakening, Fates, 3 Houses, or Engage, sometimes people just aren't going to like the art style or character tropes used.
Now here's the thing, and I alluded to this earlier, but at least as far as Awakening and Fates goes, when people used to say to anime, it was not about the art style. In fact, people praise what's his name,
Koseki's K,
for like Awakening's art style. It's like honestly some of their favorites. People love the art style for Awakening, and maybe some of the character designs are questionable, but as far as the art style went, people fucking love Awakening. What people did not like about Awakening is the actual reason why people like to use the to anime argument, at least up until Engage, because Engage is like art style wise to anime, but when it came to the characters in Awakening, they were, I guess awful isn't like the correct term, but when we talk about like trendy anime tropes, your generic tsundere yandere, you know, people give a lot of shit to Selena because she's like probably the worst character in that game, because she's just like a by the numbers tsundere character with absolutely no substance whatsoever. And honestly, like, tsunderes are not very good in general, so when you see a lot of them and they're popular, you tend to be like, yeah, this is just whatever. And this is where the crux of the two anime argument comes from, or at least where it comes from, because they're not entirely wrong, but they're definitely not entirely right either. The problem with calling things too anime, think about it. Fire Emblem used to always use classic tropes as well. Like, you can see this in Sigurd and Deirdre. Like, you can see the influence. Like, if you know what the influence is, like, you see it very clearly. And this is like something that Fire Emblem has done through its entire run. So it's not that things have gotten too anime, it's that the anime tropes that Fire Emblem is aping off of have gotten worse over time. Everything from tsunderes and yanderes and all other deries or whatever the fuck to the well, they always had the 1,000-year-old lolly thing, but like, they didn't really get shit for it until they decided, oh yeah, people find that kind of character hot, so let's make Noe. And then they just kind of went from there, and it's like, oh yeah, the people used to always joke about the incest stuff, and then they just made like wholesale incest in face, and like, that's where people are like, yeah, this is fucking terrible. It's not because it's anime, it's because anime has gotten worse over time. And no, that's not to say all anime from modern times, post 2010. It's definitely a post 2010 thing, by the way. But it's not that all the anime from like the post 2010 era is bad. It's just that a lot of it has gotten significantly worse, because there are definitely some banger animes coming from like post 2010. You can't talk to an anime fan that doesn't ride Attack on Titan as like some of the goatest, or like anything from or anything Studio Trigger does. Although they do get like their occasional like duds, but there are still good anime out there. It's just that a lot of common tropes, especially if you look at any isekai anime, they're just garbage. That's where the whole two anime thing comes from, because current anime is not very good. It tends to have some of the worst it's just that modern tropes suck ass. It's the things that Fire Emblem currently borrows off of are just not very good. That is the crux of the argument. It's just that now, with Engage, we now have a visual indicator that Fire Emblem is leaning too heavy into fan pandering and tropes. At least visually now. Personally, I think in-game, the art style actually looks quite fabulous. I'm actually kind of a fan of it. The only thing is that some of the character designs, like the Lear or whatever, are just too goofy. And actually a lot of the characters in Engage kind of goofy looking. Like, yeah, there was always like the occasional standout. Even Fates had at least one or two characters that visually just like are off-putting in comparison to the rest of the game style, but you know, now you have like a whole game of like standout flashy anime characters where it's like, oh yeah, it's not just colored hair, it's colored hair with high saturation the correct term? But you know what I mean. Everyone is flashy now, instead of like one or two characters being standout flashy. It's the broad stroke of the cast now, instead of like one or two characters. And now like this time it like extends to the main character, or the avatar in this case, because like, you know, I guess Fire Emblem avatars aren't going anywhere anytime soon. But between Robin, Corrin, Byleth, and Shez, just those four for now. Just those four, as they're from the post-Awakening era. None of them are like particularly overtly flashy, although I guess you could turn down Shez's hair shade just a little bit, please. It's not ugly or anything, but it's definitely brighter than I would consider necessary. I wanted to make this video because I thought about this argument, because it comes up a lot, and I feel like a lot of people get it kind of correct, but also not quite there. Like, Like, you're on that kind of correct side, in my opinion, sure. That the argument is deeper than what people would like to claim it is. Like, from your perspective, sure, it's an art style thing. Like, now those outcries of 2 anime have gotten worse because instead of it being tropey and more pandering, it's now visually doing the same thing. So the characters are one note, the art style is Fire Emblem has never had a quote-unquote generic art style. You feel me? Like, people make the comparison to Genshin, but that's because I think a lot of people are just addicted to garbage. So, like, they bring up Genshin for everything. Like, if you look at, like, the general feel of this game, the UI design, etc., it doesn't look like Genshin Impact. Just because, like, some of the anime characters have that modern... how do I describe this current art style trend, right? I'll have to ask art people about this because I need a description for this kind of current art style trend, because it's not like it's like a flat cartoony, not quite pastel face kind of deal. But yeah, in the end, I think it's less about the art style and more about the overall amount of things that Fire Emblem borrows when it comes to its anime influence, and less about, you know, just the art style. But in the end, the game always had its own identity. And then you have the people who argue that it's too anime now. They just really don't understand that they just dislike modern anime and the tropes that are associated with it. Which is a completely valid point, because as I said earlier, modern anime is the popular tropes in modern anime are just not that good. And from borrowing from those, it just makes the Fire Emblem experience worse, because the tropes that are being borrowed are just not that good. And that's where that comes from. But yeah, Fire Emblem's always been anime. It at least was always anime in its writing as far as the modern designs go, but now it just looks the part. So yeah, like, to be honest, it's not a totally incorrect take, but the people who say it lack the nuance to get why they don't vibe with it in the first place. Fun fact about Kaga taking pages from Gundam, Leaf looks exactly like Showa. So yeah, so to say it never looked like an anime, well, that's just like blatantly false. Like, it always like kind of had some design concepts from like whatever was like playing at the time, right? Well, it always had its own distinct character design, although some characters do look very generic, so it's kind of silly. I think there's like a sliding scale about how much is too much when it comes to like taking visual cues and character tropes from whatever is trending at the time. Take a little bit, you get to kind of have your own identity while still standing out. Take too much, and it just feels generic or whatever, depending on when it comes out. Although, for what it's worth, we already know that the Fates writers can't do serious, so the plot being a little goofy is like totally fine by me, if you ask. Because personally, I don't think every game has to be like super serious. It can still be lighthearted in tone. It could be adventurous, but it doesn't have to be like overtly serious, right? Like, it can have like some bits and pieces here and there. At least that's what I think. It doesn't have to always be dark and edgy. Because think about it, anime is like such a broad medium. It's not like just a genre. Like, so to say something is anime is like, well, what kind of anime is it? Like, is it the kind of anime that is befitting of a war story, or is it the kind of anime where it's slice of life garbage? And I'm not saying that like slice of life anime is bad or anything. There is plenty of Kino stuff that's slice of life. I mean, like that generic by the numbers moe shit, right? Oh, another thing, when Kaga said that, you know, it's not like tsunderes as a term really existed all that much during that time. So it's not like, even if he knew, or he made like a character that just happens to be a tsundere, he wasn't making it with the express intent of appeasing to anime fans who like tsunderes. So that's another thing to think about. It's the series now more than ever decides it wants to pander to weeaboos more than it wants to tell a good story, and it's been doing that for a while, so you would think people are used to it by now, but Well, so I guess not. Like, make no mistake, old Fire Emblem definitely has some things that would be considered fan service or moe in a sense, but it was never like the forefront of the games, right? Obviously. I don't know. Maybe it's just some of the anime fans these days are like old. Like some of us are just like kind of old. So maybe some of the new stuff just isn't all that appealing to us. But also it may also just be like the decline in quality of anime tropes in general. So that's also possible. And I do think the latter is true. And I'm not just saying that because I'm some weeaboomer or whatever. But you gotta take it for somebody that's like been watching anime for like a hot minute instead of like, yeah, you kind of admitted you don't watch anime, so having a very surface level understanding of it made your video look kind of uninformed. Okay, I think that's all I want to add for now. You know what to do. Yeah, like this video, give it a like, man. Leave a comment. What do you think about this two anime argument? Do you think it's grounded in some sort of argument that's just lacking nuance, or do you think it's just very dismissive criticism of a thing that you just don't like? And if you want to see more of this, you know, hit that sub button. Like, I am in the mood to do more commentary stuff like this, and I think discussing things is a lot more interesting. And I kind of know like a thing or two. I feel like I could do more of this, so let me know. Fire Emblem art style peaked with Shadows of Valentia.